In the heart of a Montana blizzard, a broke rancher heard a heavy knock on his door. When he opened it, a giant black stallion stood there. 3 trembling foals half buried in snow. Folks said only a fool would open his door in a storm like that. But he did, and that one act of mercy would change his life forever. They said only a fool would open his door in a blizzard, especially to a giant horse. The wind screamed across the Montana plains that night, rolling in waves that tore shingles from rooftops and sent dry snow swirling like smoke. The sky was a single white blur. Evan Miles sat alone in the cabin he had built with his own hands. A place too small for dreams, but just enough to keep a man alive. The fire in his stone hearth burned low, its light a tired flicker against the rough log walls. He hadn't eaten since morning. His breath rose in the cold, and every crack in the boards hummed with the ghostly moan of the wind outside. For most men, nights like this were meant for silence, waiting out nature's fury and praying the roof would hold. But Evan wasn't most men anymore. He'd buried too much behind him. His father, the ranch, his pride, and learned to keep living long after life had stopped giving him reasons. He rubbed his hands together near the flame. "Just another storm," he muttered. But he didn't believe it. He could feel something in the air tonight, something that wasn't just snow. The wind didn't howl like this unless it was carrying a story. Then came the sound. At first he thought it was the storm shifting the boards. A low thump drowned beneath the roar. But it came again, heavier this time, a deep, deliberate pounding that rattled through the floor. Evan froze, listening. 1, 2, 3 slow strikes, like a giant's heartbeat outside his door. He reached for the rifle leaning by the wall. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal as the sound came again, closer now. A shape moved beyond the frosted window, massive, black against the swirl of white. His pulse kicked hard in his throat. "No one's out there," he whispered. "Not in this weather." But something was. Another blow hit the door, so strong the hinges groaned. Then, faint through the gale, came a sound that didn't belong to wind or man. A low, broken cry, half whinny, half plea. It carried through the crack of the frame, thin but desperate. Evan swallowed hard. His boots creaked as he crossed the room. He laid his ear against the wood and heard it again. Hooves scraping, a snort, the muffled rhythm of labored breathing. A horse. Out here in this? He hesitated, staring at the latch. Opening that door could mean death. The wind alone could kill a man in minutes. But then another sound cut through the storm, softer, higher, a small cry. Not one voice, but several. Foals. Evan's stomach twisted. He'd seen what cold did to newborns, both calves and colts. They'd stumble in circles until they froze where they stood, eyes open toward nothing. He thought of the long, lonely graveyard of animals scattered across his pasture after last year's freeze. The door shuddered again. He could feel the tremor through his palm. His breath fogged the air as he whispered, "God help me." He pulled the latch. The door flew open on the sound. Winds scream. Snow blasted into the room, 1,000 needles against his face. He raised an arm to shield his eyes and blinked through the storm. There it was. A stallion, enormous, black as midnight and caked with ice, stood just beyond the threshold. Its body heaved with exhaustion, steam pouring from its nostrils like smoke from a forge. Around its legs huddled 3 foals, small and trembling, their coats soaked and stiff with frost. One stumbled, collapsing into the drift. Evan's heart hammered. He could feel the raw power of the stallion even through the storm. If it panicked, it could crush him where he stood. The smart thing, the sane thing, was to slam the door, let nature finish what it had started. But then the stallion lifted its head. Its eyes met his. 2 dim embers glowing through snow and shadow. There was no rage there, only weariness and something else. A plea. Evan's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered it. He stepped back. The stallion hesitated, then moved forward. Its massive shoulders brushed the doorframe as it entered, bringing the storm in with it. Snow and steam filled the air. The foals stumbled after their mother, hooves clattering on the wood floor. Evan kicked the door shut against the wind, sealing the 5 of them inside the narrow space. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind outside and the harsh breathing of the creatures he had just invited into his world. The fire flickered weakly. The cabin smelled of wet hide and cold iron. Evan stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh or curse himself. "You're insane," he muttered. The stallion turned its head toward him, its dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Evan felt something shift inside him, a memory he hadn't touched in years. A winter long ago when he'd been a boy half dead in the snow until a stranger had pulled him into warmth. Now he was the one holding the door. He looked at the foals, their small bodies shivering, eyes glassy with fear. One tried to nuzzle its mother and nearly fell. Evan's throat tightened. He moved slowly to the corner, grabbed an old blanket from his cot, and spread it over the little ones. They pressed together, breathing hard but alive. Outside, the storm raged louder, as if angry at being shut out. The wind clawed at the roof, but the cabin held. Inside, a fragile circle of warmth began to form. Man, fire, horse, and hope. Evan crouched near the hearth, rubbing his hands again, not sure whether the trembling came from cold or what he had just done. He glanced back at the stallion. "Well," he whispered, "looks like we're in this together." The horse exhaled, a deep rumble that rolled through the floorboards. Evan couldn't tell if it was approval or warning, but for the first time that night, he didn't feel entirely alone. The flames caught a bit higher. The storm outside wailed and shifted, hunting for another door to break. Evan leaned back against the wall, staring into the fire, and listened to the rhythm of breathing behind him. His own, and the beasts he had just welcomed into his home. He didn't know it yet, but the sound would follow him for the rest of his life. That rhythm of slow breathing, his and theirs, filled the cabin long after the wind outside had screamed itself hoarse. The fire had burned down to a tired glow, casting orange ripples across the walls. Every few minutes, the timbers creaked like old bones settling into sleep. Evan sat on the floor beside the hearth, the rifle across his knees, though even he wasn't sure whether it was for protection or comfort. Steam rose from the great stallion's coat, curling like ghosts toward the ceiling. The beast's massive body blocked half the cabin, its head low, eyes dull with exhaustion, but still watching him. Around its legs, the 3 foals huddled together under the wool blanket he'd thrown over them. Their flanks twitched as they dreamed, if horses dreamed at all. Evan couldn't remember the last time something alive had shared his fire, not since the blizzard that had taken his wife 5 winters back. The silence that followed her death had settled inside him like frost. Now, for the first time in years, there was noise again. The whisper of hooves shifting on wood, the soft huff of animal breath. It wasn't peaceful, not exactly, but it was company. He rose stiffly and crossed to his cupboard. A few cans rattled when he opened the door. Beans, coffee, and half a pouch of oats. He stared at the grains a long time, thumb tracing the edge of the bag. It was meant to last him through the next 2 weeks. The storm had already wiped out his fences. Getting to town would take days once the snow stopped. He looked back at the foals. They were too small to stand for long, their eyes cloudy with exhaustion. One lifted its head when he moved, nostrils flaring as if smelling the oats. The sound it made, a faint, breathy nicker, struck something deep inside him. "Don't look at me like that," he murmured. pouring a small handful into an old tin bowl. "We'll all be hungry soon enough." He set the bowl down near the blanket and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the foals pushed forward, nose twitching, followed by the others. Their tiny hooves clattered softly on the floorboards. They ate fast, desperate, grain spilling from their mouths. Evan watched them, half smiling despite himself. The stallion's head turned slowly. Its gaze landed on him, heavy and unreadable. Evan's hand froze halfway to his pocket. The horse's ears flicked, nostrils widening. He could feel that stare like a physical weight. "All right," he said quietly. "I didn't take it from you." The horse blinked once, then lowered its head again, the sound of steady breathing returning to the room. Evan exhaled. He sat back down beside the fire, stretching his boots toward the heat. His joints ached. The smell of wet hide filled the air, mingling with smoke and the faint sweetness of oats. Outside, the storm kept clawing at the walls, but it no longer felt as threatening. The real battle now was between hunger and conscience. He poked the coals, sending a swirl of sparks up the chimney. "Guess we're all fools tonight," he muttered. The smallest foal stumbled, then curled tighter against its siblings. Evan moved closer, pulling the blanket up around them. Their bodies were warm beneath the rough wool, warmer than he'd expected. He pressed his hand gently against one trembling side, feeling the fragile heartbeat there. "Easy," he whispered. "You're safe now." A sound answered him, not from the foals, but from the stallion. A low, rumbling breath that wasn't quite a snort. It wasn't threat or warning. It was acknowledgement. Evan sat back again. The fire painted the horse's body in bronze and shadow. He studied the creature, trying to imagine how such power could end up half dead on his doorstep. Maybe they'd escaped a ranch somewhere to the north. Maybe they'd belonged to someone richer, someone who'd decided they weren't worth the trouble when the storm rolled in. He'd seen it before, men who'd trade a horse's loyalty for a night's warmth or a few extra dollars. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his rifle. "Not you," he said softly, as if to the animal. "You didn't give up easy." The stallion's ear twitched, and for a second, Evan swore it understood. Hours passed like that, marked only by the groan of the wind and the pop of the fire. The cabin had never felt smaller, but it also had never felt so alive. When he finally dozed, it was in the chair by the hearth, the rifle leaning against his leg, the scent of hay and smoke thick in his dreams. He woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed in stillness. The fire was out, only gray ash in the hearth. Light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, pale, almost blue. He could see his breath again. The foals were still asleep, their bodies pressed tight together. The stallion stood near the door, steam no longer rising from its coat. Its head was lowered, nose close to the floor, as if listening. Evan followed its gaze and saw frost creeping along the bottom of the boards, the wood glittering like glass. He got up slowly, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "Morning, I guess," he said to no one. He opened the door a crack. The light was blinding. Miles of snow spread across the prairie, smooth and unbroken. His fence posts were buried, only the top rails peeking through like gravestones. He stepped outside far enough to fill his lungs with the freezing air, then shut the door quickly before the cold could claim more of the room. When he turned, the stallion was watching him again. Its dark eyes followed every movement. Evan reached up, palms open. "Easy there. Just looking." He noticed for the first time the scars along the animal's neck, long pale ridges under the coarse hair. They weren't from the storm. They were old, healed over years. Something, or someone, had done that. He frowned, stepping closer, but the stallion's muscles tensed, head rising. He stopped immediately. All right, not my business. He crouched beside the foals instead, checking their breathing. The smallest one stirred, pressing its nose into his sleeve. The simple contact hit him harder than he expected. He smiled faintly. Guess we're stuck with each other now. Behind him, the stallion exhaled through its nostrils, the sound low and steady. The air between them felt less like fear now, more like an understanding neither could name. Evan stood and went to stoke the fire again. He'd need to ration what little wood remained. He thought about the oats, about how long he could stretch them. Maybe a week, if he ate almost nothing himself. The thought didn't bother him as much as it should have. The stallion shifted, hooves scraping softly on the floor. Evan glanced over. The horse's head was tilted slightly toward him, one ear forward, the other turned toward the door, as if listening for something beyond. Storm's gone, Evan said. Ain't nobody coming. But the horse didn't relax. A distant sound broke the quiet. A muffled crack, like ice splitting far away. Then another. Hoofbeats. Evan went still. The stallion lifted its head higher, nostrils flaring. The foals stirred under the blanket, uneasy. The rhythm of the sound grew clearer, horses moving fast through snow. Not wild. Ridden. Evan crossed to the window and peered through a gap in the boards. The horizon was still white, the light too harsh to see clearly. But there, 3 dark shapes cutting across the drift, heading straight toward his cabin. He drew a sharp breath. Damn it! Whoever they weren't out here for a neighborly visit. Not in this weather. He turned to the stallion. You brought company, didn't you? The horse's eyes met his, steady and silent. Outside, the hoofbeats came closer. Inside, the fire caught again, throwing long shadows against the wall. Shadows that trembled like men holding their breath before the next storm. Evan moved to the window, keeping his body low. The shapes were closer now, 3 riders cutting across the pale sweep of snow, their silhouettes sharp against the blinding light. Whoever they were, they rode like men who had purpose. He could see the flash of reins, the gleam of rifles slung over their backs. He turned toward the stallion. You knew they'd come, he whispered. The black horse stood perfectly still, its head turned toward the sound. Only its ears flicked, sharp and listening. The foals pressed together under the blanket, eyes wide, trembling at the vibration of approaching hooves. Evan's cabin suddenly felt even smaller, as if the walls had drawn in to listen too. He checked his rifle. 2 cartridges left in the chamber, 5 more in his coat pocket. Not much comfort if trouble came calling, but it was all he had. He blew out a slow breath and set the gun near the hearth, close enough to reach. The knock came a minute later, 3 heavy thuds that rattled the door on its hinges. Evan hesitated, his pulse climbing. The stallion snorted, shifting its weight. The sound was low, warning. All right, easy, Evan muttered. He took 1 step toward the door, then another. The wind howled through a crack in the frame, whistling like a flute. He eased the latch just enough to speak through the gap. Who's there? A man's voice answered, rough with cold and smoke. Neighbor from down the ridge got caught out. Need a hand. Evan frowned. There was no ridge close enough for a man to have wandered here by chance. Ain't many neighbors in this part of Montana, he said. The voice came again, lighter this time. Then maybe I'm lucky to find one. Through the narrow slit, Evan saw a flash of a wide-brimmed hat and the glint of metal under a coat. He didn't open the door further. Can't help you much, he said. Got nothing to spare. A pause. Then a laugh, low, humorless. I can see that. Shame, though. Word around says you've got something mighty valuable in there. Big, black, and hard to miss. Evan's hand tightened on the doorframe. The stallion let out a deep breath behind him, hooves shifting on the floor. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do. The man's tone sharpened. See, my boss has been looking for that horse. Claims it belongs to him. Says it ran off with 3 foals during the last storm. You wouldn't happen to be hiding it, would you, Cowboy? Evan shut the door before the words finished echoing. His heart hammered. Through the wood, he heard the creak of saddles and the snort of the riders' horses. The stallion turned toward him, muscles tightening like a drawn bow. The firelight caught the old scars across its neck again, and for the first time Evan noticed a faint brand, half hidden under the hair, a circle with 2 letters burned inside. C.W. Cole Whitman. The name hit him like a fist. Every ranch hand in Montana had heard of Whitman, the cattle king, owner of half the valley, rich enough to buy silence when he needed it. If the stallion had once belonged to him, this wasn't over. Evan's mind raced. He looked at the horse. You picked the wrong door, friend. Outside, the voice called again. We'll come back tomorrow. The boss wants his property. Then the sound of reins snapping, hoofbeats fading into the frozen horizon. Evan stood motionless until the silence returned. Only the wind remained, whispering through the cracks. He turned to the stallion, meeting its gaze. You hear that? They'll be back. The horse didn't move. Its breath fogged the air, slow and steady. The foals stirred under the blanket, one giving a small, weak whinny. Evan crouched beside them, running a hand down their trembling backs. Looks like I bought myself a fight, he said softly. He tossed another piece of wood into the fire and watched the flames climb higher. The warmth touched his face, but the chill inside him stayed. He wasn't a man who went looking for trouble, but trouble had found him anyway. The night deepened, heavy with thought. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder, every gust of wind sharper. The foals eventually drifted back into uneasy sleep. Evan stayed awake, sitting in the chair with the rifle resting across his lap, staring at the stallion. He studied the animal's strength, the rise and fall of its ribs, the flicker of firelight along its mane. Something about it refused to bow, even here, surrounded by strangers and walls too small for its size. It reminded him of himself, worn down but not yet broken. Shadowmane, he murmured, testing the word. It felt right. That's your name. The horse lifted its head slightly at the sound, as if acknowledging it. Evan smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. All right then, Shadowmane. If those men come back, we'll face them together. Outside, the wind began to die. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving only the deep hush that follows chaos. Evan leaned his head back against the chair, listening to the slow rhythm of hooves shifting and fire crackling. But sleep wouldn't come easy. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the mark on the stallion's neck, CW, burning like a brand across his thoughts. He'd heard stories about Whitman's horses. Some said the man bred them for labor in his iron mines, beasts treated worse than the men who worked beside them. If that was true, it explained the scars. It also meant that letting this one go back wasn't an option. He whispered to the dark, "They'll come for you, big fella. Maybe for me, too." The stallion shifted, tail flicking once. Evan stared into the fire until dawn bled through the cracks in the shutters. The world outside had turned to ice. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his back, and opened the door. A blast of cold slapped his face, but the sky was clear now, a wide blue so sharp it almost hurt to look at. Snow glittered across the land, untouched except for a single trail of hoof prints leading away. They'd be back, He could feel it. He shut the door and turned toward the animals. The foals stirred, lifting their heads. Shadowmane watched him steadily, the light catching the faint gold in his dark eyes. For the first time since the storm began, Evan smiled, thin but real. Guess the storm wasn't the worst thing knocking on my door after all. The cabin filled again with the quiet sound of breathing. 5 hearts still beating against the odds. 5 souls bound by one foolish act of kindness. And outside, somewhere beyond the horizon, another storm was already gathering. The morning sun crawled over the frozen ridge, spilling pale light into the cabin through cracks in the boards. Evan stood by the window, one hand resting on the frame, the other holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The world outside was silent, the kind of silence that came only after nature had screamed herself empty. But under that stillness, he could sense a new kind of tension, a quiet warning that what had begun last night wasn't over. Behind him, Shadowmane shifted his weight, hooves scraping against the wooden floor. The 3 foals huddled close, their breath misting in the air. They had made it through another night. Evan watched the stallion lower his head and nudge one of the little ones to stand. The foal stumbled, legs trembling, but it rose. That simple act, the struggle, the stubborn will to live, hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He rubbed a hand over his face. "I guess that makes 2 of us," he said softly. He turned toward the table where his food stores lay open. A single sack of beans, one of oats nearly empty, and a small piece of jerky no thicker than a finger. The firewood pile was shrinking, too. He calculated what he had left and felt the weight of it in his chest. The horse had saved his heart last night, but might very well cost him his life now. He stared at the stallion again. Shadowmane's dark coat gleamed faintly in the light, the old scars along his neck stark as white lightning bolts. That brand, CW, seemed to burn even when the fire was out. Cole Whitman. The name alone could empty a saloon. If Whitman wanted his horse back, he'd send more than 3 riders next time. Evan tightened his jaw. "Not if I can help it." He pulled on his coat, stepped outside, and was met by the full bite of the cold. The snow came up to his knees, glittering sharp as crushed glass. He trudged toward the small barn a few yards from the cabin, half collapsed under the weight of the storm. The door hung crooked, creaking like an old man's bones. Inside, what little hay he had left was frozen into stiff, useless clumps. He picked through it anyway, managing to fill a bucket with what could pass for feed. When he came back, the stallion was waiting near the door, ears pricked forward, as if he'd been listening for him. Evan set the bucket down. "Here," he said. "It's not much." The stallion sniffed the hay, then began to eat, slow and deliberate. The foals joined in, their small jaws working fast. Evan leaned against the wall, watching, his breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. He'd always thought of mercy as something you gave when you had enough to spare. But now he realized it was what you gave when you didn't. When they finished, he took the empty bucket back to the hearth and stirred the fire. The flames flared, casting long ribbons of gold across the room. The warmth was a small relief, but his stomach twisted with hunger. He had given them all the feed. By late afternoon, the wind had returned. Not the blizzard's scream, but a steady, uneasy whistle that threaded through the cracks in the cabin walls. The world outside had turned gray again, clouds thickening like smoke on the horizon. He could smell snow coming. He sat at the table, carving a splinter of wood between his fingers. His thoughts circled back to the riders. They hadn't come to ask, they'd come to warn. Whitman's men were as patient as the weather. They'd wait for the next break in the storm, and then they'd ride in with more guns. Evan stared at the rifle propped near the fire. 2 cartridges in the chamber. Enough to make a point. not enough to win a fight. He turned toward Shadowmane. The horse's head lifted, eyes reflecting the firelight. Evan met the gaze, feeling the old ache of something he couldn't quite name. Trust, maybe, or the beginnings of it. "I should have shut that door," he muttered. "Would have been easier." But he knew he wouldn't have. Not then, not now. The foals stirred, bumping against each other as they tried to find space on the straw. One of them, the smallest, let out a faint cry and slumped sideways. Evan was at its side in an instant. Its body was cold under his hands, too still. "Come on," he whispered. "Not tonight." He lifted the small creature's head, rubbing its neck to stir some warmth. Shadowmane stepped closer, a low rumble echoing in his chest. Evan could feel the heat of the stallion's breath on his shoulder. The foal's sides rose once, twice, then stopped. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear his own heartbeat. Evan set the body down gently, wrapping it in a piece of burlap. He didn't bury it right away. There was no digging in frozen ground. Instead, he carried it outside to a small rise where the snow had drifted less deep, laying it there under the open sky. He stood for a long time, hat in his hands, while the wind combed through the grass beneath the ice. "Sorry, little one," he said quietly. When he returned, Shadowmane was still standing by the door, eyes fixed on him. For a moment, Evan could have sworn there was understanding there. Not human, but something older and deeper. The stallion bowed its head, the muscles in its neck trembling. Evan stepped closer, resting a hand against the animal's shoulder. "I know," he whispered. "You did what you could." The horse exhaled, long and low, and for the first time since the storm began, Evan felt the tightness in his chest loosen just a little. That night, the fire burned higher than before. He fed it with the last of the split logs, not caring about tomorrow. He sat close to the warmth, the foals curled together nearby, Shadowmane standing guard at the door like a sentinel carved from black iron. Every so often, the stallion would turn its head toward the window, ears flicking. Evan followed its gaze but saw only darkness. "You're waiting for them, aren't you?" he said softly. "Whitman's men." The horse didn't move. Evan took a long, slow breath. "Let them come." The flames popped, sending sparks drifting up the chimney. Outside, the clouds rolled low and heavy, the first flakes of a new storm beginning to fall. He sat there, the weight of the long night pressing down on him, and realized mercy was never free. Every act of kindness had its cost, and sometimes that price came due sooner than you expected. The wind rose again, whispering against the door as if testing the hinges, and somewhere far off in that white darkness, a horse whinnied, a cry that did not belong to Shadowmane. Evan's hand went to the rifle. The sound outside was faint at first, a soft rhythm that rose and fell against the wind, too steady to be the storm and too deliberate to be chance. Hooves again, the kind that carried men. He stood motionless, listening. Each beat came closer, crunching through the new snow. The foals stirred beneath the blanket, ears twitching. Shadowmane lifted his head from where he stood by the door, muscles bunching, breath steaming like a blacksmith's forge. Evan crossed to the window, moving in silence. The glass was frosted over, so he cleared a circle with his sleeve and peered out. Through the blur of white, a single rider approached. Dark coat, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, horse kicking up slow puffs of powder. Whoever it was, they rode with confidence, not hesitation. The kind of man who believed the world would step aside for him. Evan's grip tightened on the rifle. "So they've found me." He turned toward the stallion. "Stay quiet," he whispered, though he doubted the horse needed telling. A minute later came the knock, firm, sharp, 3 strikes that rattled the frame. Evan opened the door a crack, enough for a strip of light to fall across the man's face. The stranger was tall, wrapped in a fur-lined coat dusted white, eyes pale as river ice. A thin scar traced his cheek. He tipped his hat slightly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," he said. "Name's Harlan. Wade Harlan. I believe you're the man they call Miles." Evan didn't answer. The wind pushed at the door, trying to claw its way in. "I'm looking for something," Harlan went on, voice smooth as oil. "Big horse, black as pitch, went missing from Mr. Whitman's spread up north. Heard tell it might have wandered down this way." Evan's heart beat slow and hard. "Ain't seen any horse like that." Harlan's smile widened, cold and knowing. "No? That's odd. One of our boys passed this ridge yesterday. Said he saw tracks heading straight to your door." "Tracks don't mean much," Evan said. "Snow shifts. You could follow a rabbit and end up at your own fence." Harlan chuckled softly, taking a step closer. "You've got a way with words, Mr. Miles. But Mr. Whitman's patient runs short when folks lie to him, and he don't take kindly to thieves." Evan's jaw tightened. "Then you can tell your boss I'm no thief." Harlan leaned in, his voice dropping low. "Then let me take a look inside. Clear your name." Evan's finger brushed the trigger guard. "You're not welcome here." The man studied him for a moment, then smiled again, small and mean. "I see. Well, you think on it, friend. Storm's done, but the snow'll melt soon. Tracks'll show clearer then. And when they do, Mr. Whitman'll come himself." He tipped his hat. "Wouldn't want him thinking you're hiding what's his." With that, Harlan turned and mounted his horse. The sound of hooves faded down the slope, swallowed by the wind. Evan closed the door, leaning against it until the tremor in his hands passed. The cabin was silent again, except for the soft crackle of the fire. Shadowmane stood watching him, eyes dark and steady. Evan set the rifle aside and met the stallion's gaze. "That man wasn't bluffing," he said. "Whitman's coming, and he'll bring trouble with him." He walked to the table, poured a bit of cold coffee into a tin cup, and drank. It tasted like ashes. Outside, the snow was falling harder again, fine and silent, too calm, like the hush before a gunfight. The foals began to stir, pushing the blanket aside with small, clumsy movements. Evan knelt to check them. They were still weak, but breathing easier. He rubbed one between the ears, the smallest of them all. "Don't you worry," he murmured. "Ain't nobody taking you." But the words felt thin against the weight of what was coming. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every creak of timber sounded like boots in the snow. He sat by the fire with the rifle across his lap, watching the flames rise and fall. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes. Coyotes, maybe, or worse. Just before dawn, a noise snapped him awake from half-sleep, a sharp metallic clink near the window. He moved silently, leveling the rifle. Through the narrow crack, he caught sight of movement, a flash of metal, a gloved hand pulling something back. Then the shadow of a face peering in. Evan kicked the door open and raised the rifle. "That's far enough!" The intruder jumped back, hands raised. It wasn't Harlan this time, but a boy, barely 20, cheeks red with cold, eyes wide. He wore Whitman's brand on his coat. "I wasn't stealing," he stammered. "Just making sure you were still here." Evan kept the gun trained. "You work for Whitman?" The boy nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Mr. Harlan said to check the ridge. He said the black horse is worth more than a year's pay." Evan's finger hovered on the trigger, then lowered. "You best go home before you freeze or get yourself shot." The boy hesitated, looking past Evan toward the stallion visible in the firelight. His eyes went wide. "Lord above," he whispered. "That's him. That's Shadowmane." Evan stepped forward, blocking his view. You didn't see nothing. Understand? The boy swallowed hard. Mr. Whitman'll find out anyway. He always does. Not if you keep your mouth shut. Something in Evan's tone must have worked, because the boy nodded quickly and backed away. All right, I'll go. He turned and ran into the snow, vanishing down the ridge. Evan shut the door and stood there, the cold creeping back into his bones. Shadowmane snorted softly, shaking his mane. Yeah, Evan said, rubbing his temple. We're running out of time. He walked to the window again, watching the trail vanish under falling snow. He knew Whitman would come soon, and when he did, it wouldn't be for talk. Still, when he looked at the horses, the foals now sleeping close to the stallion's legs, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. The storm outside might come and go, but the one inside him had already settled for good. Evan sat back in his chair, staring into the fire until his vision blurred. The rifle rested against his knee, ready but heavy. Somewhere out in the snow, the sound of a distant hammer rang out, metal against metal. Someone setting shoes on horses, preparing to ride. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before battles, before bad days, and he knew with a calm that surprised him that Mercy's price hadn't finished climbing yet. The next morning broke gray and cold. The wind had died, but the sky hung heavy and low, like a ceiling made of iron. Evan sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face, the fear, the recognition. That meant Whitman knew now, or soon would. Shadowmane stood near the door, motionless but alert. Frost still clung to his mane, glittering in the dull light. The foals lay curled beneath the blanket, their breathing soft and steady. The smallest one stirred, head resting on the stallion's leg. The sight pulled something deep inside Evan's chest, an ache he couldn't name. You shouldn't have come here, he said quietly, eyes on the horse. You brought your ghosts with you. But part of him already knew that the ghosts hadn't come with the horse. They'd been here all along. By midday, he decided to ride out. He needed supplies, maybe news. If Whitman's men were coming, he had to know how many. The storm had left the ground packed hard, snow crusted over like glass. He saddled his old bay mare, the only other horse left on the property, and glanced back at the cabin before mounting up. Stay quiet, he said to Shadowmane, and keep those little ones close. The stallion blinked slowly, then turned his head toward the foals, as if he understood. Evan rode south toward town. The wind bit at his face, carrying the smell of pine and iron from the valley. The world was nothing but white and gray until the faint outline of buildings appeared in the distance. 3 stores, a blacksmith's shed, and a saloon that leaned sideways like it had given up. He tied his horse outside and stepped into the general store. The bell over the door jingled, startling in the quiet. Behind the counter stood Dr. Nora Briggs, her sleeves rolled up, spectacles fogged from the chill. She wasn't a doctor by license, but folks called her that anyway. She knew enough medicine and horsecraft to fix most things short of death. Well, I'll be, she said, squinting. Evan Miles back from the dead. Just mostly frozen, he said, managing a thin smile. She handed him a tin cup of coffee before he even asked. I heard there's trouble up your way. Men say Whitman's been riding north, looking for something. Evan sipped the coffee, letting the heat sting his tongue. He's looking for a horse, he said finally. Big one, black. Got a few little ones with it. Nora's hand stilled halfway through stacking jars. Shadowmane? Evan looked up sharply. You know that name? Everyone in these parts does. She leaned on the counter. Whitman's prize stallion, stronger than anything bred in this valley. Folks said he was half wild, too smart for men. But when Whitman's mind caved last spring, he blamed that horse for spooking the workers. Ordered him shot. Some ranch hands couldn't do it. They turned him loose instead. Thought he'd die out there. Evan felt the pieces slide together. The scars, the brand, the fear in the animal's eyes. He didn't die. Nora studied him a moment. You took him in, didn't you? Evan said nothing. She sighed. Then you best be careful. Whitman's men don't knock twice. They'll burn what they can't take. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight settle heavier on his shoulders. Still, Nora said, softer now, if you've got him, it means that horse chose you, and if he did, you might want to think twice before giving him back. Evan met her eyes. Wasn't planning on it. When he left town, the sun was already dipping behind the ridge, painting the snow gold and red. He rode hard, the cold air biting at his lungs. But as he neared the cabin, something stopped him cold. Smoke. A thin line of it rose above the trees, drifting lazily into the sky. His stomach dropped. He spurred his horse forward, heart hammering. The cabin was still standing when he reached it, but the air stank of burnt wood. A small section of the outer wall was charred black. The snow around it melted into dirty puddles. Whoever had come hadn't stayed long, just long enough to send a message. Shadowmane stood near the doorway, unhurt but restless, tail flicking. The foals huddled close behind him, eyes wide. Evan dismounted and ran a hand down the stallion's neck. They were here, weren't they? He whispered. The horse snorted, a deep, angry sound that rumbled through its chest. Evan could almost feel the fury under his skin. He crouched beside the scorched boards, finding a half-burnt piece of wood driven into the ground near the steps. A single mark had been carved into it. A W, deep and deliberate. Cole Whitman's calling card. Evan rose slowly, jaw clenched. He looked at the endless white stretching around him, so calm it almost mocked him. So that's how it's gonna be, he muttered. He went inside and rebuilt the fire. The cabin filled again with the smell of smoke and heat. He sat in the chair by the window, rifle across his knees. Shadowmane paced once, then stopped beside him. You and me, Evan said quietly. We've both been branded by that man, one way or another. The stallion turned its head slightly, the firelight catching the faint gold in its eyes. Evan reached out, resting a hand on the horse's muzzle. The animal didn't pull away. Outside, night crept down the mountains like a slow tide. The world was still again, but Evan knew the silence wouldn't last. Cole Whitman was coming, and when he did, he wouldn't just be after a horse. He'd be after pride, revenge, and whatever small piece of peace Evan Miles had left to lose. Evan stared into the fire until it blurred, until the crackling became the sound of hoofbeats in his mind. He whispered to no one, if he wants a fight, he'll get one. Shadowmane blew a warm breath across his sleeve, a sound almost like agreement, and outside, under the bruised sky of another Montana night, the horizon glowed faintly red, the color of fire waiting to rise again. Evan Miles woke before sunrise, though he wasn't sure he'd ever truly slept. The air inside the cabin was sharp with cold and smoke. He stirred the fire back to life, the crackle of flame breaking the silence that had settled over everything. The foals slept close together near the hearth, their coats gleaming faintly in the amber light. Shadowmane stood near the door, head high, ears twitching at every faint sound beyond the walls. Evan poured a little water from the kettle into a tin mug and took a slow sip. It tasted faintly of ash. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from knowing what the day was about to bring. The W carved into the scorched plank outside wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Cole Whitman would come to collect what he thought was his. The world outside was still dark when Evan heard the first sound, the echo of hoofbeats on frozen ground. Not one or two horses this time, but several, steady, unhurried, confident. He set down the mug and reached for his rifle. Through the small window, he saw them emerging through the gray light like ghosts. 4 riders, their breath fogging the air, their silhouettes sharp against the snow. At the center rode a man on a pale horse, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat trimmed with wolf fur. Even from a distance, Evan knew. Cole Whitman. He was older than Evan expected, hair gone silver at the temples, face carved from stone, eyes cold and certain. He looked like a man who'd never been told no. The riders stopped at the edge of the yard. Whitman dismounted first, slow and deliberate, brushing the frost from his gloves. "Evan Miles!" he called, his voice deep, carrying easily through the still morning. "You've got something that belongs to me." Evan opened the door, stepping out with the rifle resting casually against his shoulder. "You've got a habit of burning down what you can't prove is yours," he said evenly. Whitman smiled faintly. "That's so. I only burn what's been stolen." "Then you'd best start with your own soul." The other men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their holsters. Whitman held up a hand. "No need for that. Not yet." He took a few steps forward, boots crunching through the snow. "I ain't here for a fight, Miles. I just came for what's mine. That stallion, Shadowmane. You've got no idea what kind of animal you're harboring, dangerous as they come. I'd hate to see you or your place torn to bits when he turns mean again." Evan met his gaze. "Funny. He's been here 2 weeks and hasn't hurt a soul. Seems the only danger comes from the men riding under your name." Whitman's jaw flexed. "You talk bold for a man living in a shack held together by nails and pride. Let's not pretend you're doing this out of charity. You're sitting on a fortune. That horse's bloodline's worth more than your whole property. Then I reckon you can afford to walk away." Whitman's smile vanished. "You think this is a choice?" Evan didn't answer. He just stood there, the wind stirring his coat, the barrel of the rifle glinting dull in the light. The silence stretched until it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Finally, Whitman stepped closer. His eyes moved past Evan toward the cabin door, where the faint shadow of Shadowmane flickered behind the thin window curtain. The stallion had seen him too. Evan could hear the shift of hooves on wood, the low rumble deep in the animal's chest. "That horse has my brand," Whitman said quietly. "You can't hide that." Evan nodded once. "I've seen it. Question is, what else did you burn into him?" Whitman's face hardened. "You think I mistreated him?" "I think you broke something you didn't understand," Evan said. "And when it wouldn't kneel, you tried to kill it." Whitman's breath fogged the air. "You're wrong. I tried to save him, from himself. That horse killed a man at my mine. Spooked, kicked the supports loose, brought down half the tunnel. You telling me that's a creature fit to live among people?" Evan's eyes didn't waver. Maybe he wasn't the only one in that mine who panicked. Whitman's hand brushed the butt of his revolver. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you what you are." The moment hung there like a drawn blade. One of Whitman's men shifted nervously, the creak of leather sharp in the air. But before anyone moved, the cabin door burst open. Shadowmane stepped into the light. The stallion filled the doorway, black coat gleaming, breath clouding the air in thick white plumes. The foals pressed against his legs, small shapes trembling but defiant. The sight froze Whitman in place. For a heartbeat, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Good Lord," he whispered. Evan turned, watching the man's face. There was something in Whitman's eyes, not anger now, but shock. The kind that came from seeing something you'd buried long ago rise back from the dirt. "That horse," Whitman said, voice shaking slightly. "He's not supposed to be here." Evan frowned. "He is now." Whitman took a slow step forward, almost dazed. When that mine collapsed, my wife was down there. She loved that animal, said he was gentle as spring water. I told her he'd gone bad. She went in to see for herself. The mountain took her instead. His voice roughened. After that, I ordered him killed. Couldn't stand the sight of him. Evan felt the wind cut through him colder than before. So you blamed the beast for what you did. Whitman's eyes flicked toward him, the old hardness returning. Maybe. But blame doesn't change ownership. He's mine. Evan raised the rifle, not aiming yet, but making his meaning clear. Not anymore. The men behind Whitman reached for their guns, but the stallion's roar broke the standoff before any shot could fire. It wasn't a neigh. It was a deep, thunderous sound that shook the air, primal and wild. The foals pressed closer. Whitman stumbled back a step, startled. Evan didn't move. "You hear that?" he said. "That's not your horse talking. That's freedom." Whitman's face twisted. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Evan said, "but I won't forget it." Whitman turned sharply, swinging into his saddle. "You've got till sundown to send him back," he called over his shoulder. "After that, I'll take what's mine, by law or by gun." The riders wheeled around and disappeared down the trail, their hooves drumming a warning across the snow. Evan stood in the yard long after they were gone, the rifle still warm in his hands. The wind carried away the last of the hoofbeats, leaving only the faint crackle of ice settling on the roof. He turned back toward the stallion, who stood in the doorway, calm now, but watching him. "Well," Evan said softly, "we just bought ourselves a war." Shadowmane stepped forward, breath ghosting in the cold, his eyes reflecting the pale morning light. Evan could almost believe he understood. Somewhere behind them, the first snowflakes began to fall again. Soft, silent, relentless. Evan stood at the door long after Cole Whitman and his men disappeared down the ridge. The echo of their hoofbeats seemed to linger in the bones of the earth. He could feel it even now. A promise of violence wrapped in silence. The kind that always came before a storm. He set the rifle back on its hook and ran a hand through his hair, the weariness hitting him like a weight. Inside, the cabin was warm and dim, the air thick with the smell of smoke and horses. The foals stirred near the hearth, pressing close to one another for comfort. Shadowmane stood over them, still as carved obsidian, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. Evan crouched beside the stallion, speaking softly. "You didn't flinch. Not once. I reckon that rattled him more than my gun ever could." Shadowmane's ears flicked, and for a moment, Evan could have sworn the horse understood. The two of them, man and beast, stood in that fragile peace for a long while, the wind whistling faintly through the chinks in the wall. By sundown, the temperature dropped again. The new storm rolled in from the west, not as fierce as the last, but heavy with the weight of something inevitable. Evan boarded the windows and checked his rifle twice. Every instinct told him Whitman wouldn't wait for morning. He fed the fire until it roared, casting long ribbons of orange light across the cabin. The shadows danced like restless spirits on the walls. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, tapping against the glass in soft, steady rhythms. Evan sat in his chair with his coat still on, listening. The minutes stretched thin. Then, far off in the storm, he heard it. Hoofbeats again, faint but growing. He rose quietly, motioning to Shadowmane. The stallion lifted his head, nostrils flaring. The foals huddled closer to the fire, sensing the change in the air. The sound grew louder, joined by the creak of saddles and the faint jingle of spurs. Evan moved to the window and peered out. The world was a blur of gray and white, but he could see them this time. Lanterns, bobbing like fireflies in the dark. At least 6 riders, maybe more, advancing slow and deliberate. Damn, he whispered. The horses stopped at the edge of the yard. Then came the voice, Whitman's, steady and cold through the snow. "Last chance, Miles. You've got what's mine. Step aside and I'll leave you your house and your skin. Defy me and you'll lose both." Evan's voice was steady when he called back. "You had your chance. You lost it the day you branded him like property." A pause. Then Whitman's voice again, lower now, darker. "So be it." The first shot shattered the window. Evan dove to the floor, glass exploding around him. The foals whinnied, terrified, scattering in the tight space. Shadowmane reared, his front hooves striking the wood floor with a thunderous crack. Evan crawled behind the table, returning fire through the window. His shot hit the snowbank inches from one of the riders, who ducked behind his horse. The night filled with flashes of light and the roar of guns. Then, without warning, the sound shifted. A crack ripped through the ceiling. Snow and ice poured down in a white torrent as the roof gave way. The storm outside howled, joining the chaos inside. Evan shouted, dragging one of the foals out from under falling beams. The entire cabin trembled. One of Whitman's bullets must have hit a support beam, and the weight of snow above finished the job. A massive timber fell across the hearth, scattering embers that hissed and smoked. "Get out!" Evan yelled, kicking the door open. Shadowmane was already moving. He swept forward through the swirling snow, muscles rippling under his coat. He nudged the foals toward the open air, his massive frame blocking the falling debris. Evan followed them into the storm, choking on smoke and cold. The world outside was a blur of wind and white, lanterns flickering through the snowfall. He ducked behind the old water trough, gasping for breath, watching as the cabin's roof sagged inward with a deep groan. Then it collapsed entirely. The fire roared up into the snow-filled sky, sparks scattering like 1,000 tiny stars. Whitman's men hesitated at the sight. The heat from the burning cabin painted their faces orange and gold. Whitman himself rode closer, eyes wide in disbelief. "You fool! Sao Chauto! You've killed them!" But before the words could fade, a shape rose from the firelight. Massive, dark, and alive. Shadowmane stepped out from the wreckage, mane streaming like smoke, eyes burning like molten amber. The stallion reared, front hooves slamming down into the snow with a sound like thunder breaking loose. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. Even the wind paused. Whitman's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing him. His men scrambled back, shouting. Evan, crouched near the trough, could only stare. The stallion looked like something born of the storm itself. Wild, defiant, unstoppable. Whitman fought his reins and wheeled his horse around, barking orders. "Fall back! Now!" The men obeyed, retreating into the snow, their lanterns vanishing one by one into the dark. When the last echo of hooves faded, Evan rose slowly, chest heaving. The snow hissed as it fell onto the smoldering ruin of the cabin. The heat melted flakes before they touched the ground. Shadowmane stood motionless in the firelight, his sides heaving, steam rising from his body. The foals pressed close to his legs, trembling but alive. Evan approached cautiously, his boots crunching in the wet snow. "Easy, big fella," he said softly. "It's over." The stallion's ears flicked toward him. Then, to Evan's disbelief, the horse took one unsteady step forward and bowed his head, not in fear, but in exhaustion. Evan rested a hand against the horse's neck. "You saved us." The stallion's breath rolled warm across his sleeve, a low rumble deep in his chest. Evan looked back at the ruins of the cabin, his home, what little life he had built, now nothing but embers. He should have felt broken. Instead, he felt strangely calm. In the glow of the burning wood, man and beast stood side by side, framed by the falling snow. The flames cracked and hissed, But their warmth was nothing compared to the quiet understanding between them. Evan knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And somewhere far down the ridge, the faint sound of retreating hoofbeats turned again toward the valley. Whitman was not finished. Not yet. Evan Miles stood in the pale light of dawn, his breath rising in steady plumes. Behind him, the cabin still smoked, a blackened frame against the white world. It had taken all night for the fire to die, and even now the snow hissed softly as it melted around the embers. The scent of burned wood clung to his clothes. He turned toward Shadowmane, who stood beside the ruins with the foals pressed close to his flank. The stallion's coat was streaked with ash, but his eyes were alive, fierce as ever. When Evan looked at him, he felt something stir, a quiet kind of awe, the same way a man might feel standing before a mountain. "Guess home's gone," he murmured, voice rough. "But you and me, we're still breathing." He knew they couldn't stay here. The open clearing made them targets, and Whitman wouldn't let the fire be the last word. Somewhere out there, he'd be regrouping, angrier now, humiliated. Evan packed what little he could salvage: his rifle, a handful of cartridges, a wool blanket that hadn't burned, and 2 sacks of grain that had been stored in the shed. He loaded them onto a small sled, then whistled softly. Shadowmane stepped forward, lowering his head as if volunteering to pull. "Not yet, boy," Evan said gently. "You've done enough." He hitched the sled to his old mare instead, and began the slow trek toward higher ground. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a strange, eerie calm. The snow sparkled under a blue sky too bright to be trusted. Every step of his boots crunched in the quiet, the sound swallowed quickly by the emptiness around them. By afternoon, they reached a small stand of pines overlooking the frozen creek, a place sheltered from the wind. Evan cleared a patch of snow and built a new fire. It wasn't much, but it would do. He spread the blanket for the foals and watched them curl together, exhaustion overtaking fear. For a while he just sat there, staring at the flames. His body ached, but his mind churned. Whitman's story, his wife, the mine, the accusation, it all gnawed at him. There was something missing, something that didn't fit. When Shadowmane shifted nearby, Evan's eyes caught on the stallion's neck. The brand. It was ugly and raised, the letters CW burned deep into the flesh, but beneath it, something looked wrong, a faint outline beneath the scar, almost like another mark buried under time. Evan frowned. He rose, stepping closer. "Easy, fella," he said softly. The stallion stood still, only his ears flicking. Evan brushed the snow from the horse's neck and leaned in closer. The edges of the brand were uneven, newer than the scars around it. Someone had burned that CW over another symbol. He ran his hand along the lines, tracing them. There, a curve, faint but deliberate, a letter, maybe an E. Evan stepped back slowly, his breath catching. "Who were you before he marked you?" he whispered. As if in answer, the stallion exhaled sharply, a cloud of steam rolling from his nostrils. That night, as the fire burned low, Evan couldn't shake the thought. The way Whitman had looked at Shadowmane, half fear, half guilt. The way he'd said, "He's not supposed to be here." There was more to it. By morning, Evan decided he needed help. He couldn't uncover the truth alone. He thought of Dr. Nora Briggs back in town, the woman who knew more about horses and men than most preachers knew about souls. Maybe she could tell him what that mark really meant. He left the foals nestled in the straw near the fire and spoke quietly to the stallion. "I'll be back before sundown. Keep watch." Shadowmane flicked his tail, eyes calm but alert. Evan took that as understanding. The walk into town took most of the morning. His muscles screamed from the cold, but the thought of Whitman finding them first kept him moving. When he finally reached the edge of the settlement, the streets were near empty, just the crunch of boots and the groan of wagons over packed snow. Nora's small clinic sat behind the general store, smoke curling from its chimney. She looked up as Evan entered, surprise flashing across her face. "Back again? You look worse than last time," she said, setting aside a ledger. "I need you to look at something," Evan said. "A horse. Big one. You'll know him when you see him." She frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "You brought him here?" "No. He's hidden up by the ridge, but I found something on him under the brand." That got her attention. "Show me." Evan picked up a scrap of paper from her counter and drew the shape with a stub of charcoal. The CW brand. And beneath it, the faint line of another mark. An E, curling like a signature. Nora's breath caught. "E," she whispered. "That's not a ranch mark. That's personal. Whitman's wife, Eliza. She used to mark her horses that way." The E stood for her name. Evan's pulse quickened. "So that horse belonged to her?" "Yes," Nora said slowly. "She raised him herself from a colt. Everyone knew she adored that animal. Whitman couldn't stand it. Said she cared more for the beast than for him. When she died in that cave-in, he swore Shadow Mane caused it. But I always wondered." Evan leaned on the counter, his voice low. He branded over her mark, to erase her from him. Nora nodded. "That's what it sounds like." The weight of it settled between them. The stallion wasn't just a survivor. He was a living ghost of the woman Whitman had lost and then tried to destroy. Evan felt the truth like a wound reopening. He's coming for the horse because he can't stand to see what he buried still breathing. Nora met his eyes. "Then you'd best be ready. Whitman's men are already in town. They'll ride north by nightfall." Evan turned for the door. "Let 'em ride." Outside, the wind had picked up again, scattering fine snow like ash. He cinched his coat tighter and started back toward the ridge. By the time he reached the camp, the sun was sinking behind the mountains. The foals whinnied softly at his approach. Shadow Mane stood tall at the edge of the clearing, mane whipping in the wind. Evan went to him and laid a hand on his neck. "I know who you were," he said, "and I know what he did to you. But he doesn't own that brand anymore." The stallion's breath came in slow, heavy gusts. Then, almost like an answer, he lowered his head, resting it lightly against Evan's shoulder. The contact was brief but powerful, like the earth itself had reached out to say, "We understand each other now." In that moment, Evan realized it wasn't just the horse he'd been protecting. It was the memory of someone else's kindness, burned but not erased. He looked toward the dark horizon, where torches would soon rise again. "All right then," he whispered. "Let's finish this." The cold had teeth that night. Every breath Evan took burned on the way in and froze on the way out. The wind had shifted to the east, dragging with it a wall of snow so fine it looked like smoke. Somewhere beyond that haze, men were riding. He could feel them as surely as he could feel the pulse of the land beneath his boots. He tossed another log on the fire. The foals lay close to its warmth, their small bodies trembling in their sleep. Shadow Mane stood over them, head low but alert, every muscle coiled beneath his dark hide. Evan crouched beside the flames, tightening the strap of his rifle. "They'll come up the ridge first," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Whitman's the kind that likes to see his work done up close." The stallion turned his head, one ear flicking toward the sound of his voice. Evan smiled grimly. "We'll give him a welcome worth remembering." By the time the first flicker of light appeared in the distance, the snow had stopped. The world had gone eerily still. the kind of stillness that felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Evan rose to his feet, brushing snow from his coat. Down the ridge, a line of torches bobbed through the dark, 7, maybe 8 riders, moving in a slow arc toward the clearing, Whitman at the center. "Stay here," Evan whispered to Shadowmane, though he knew it was useless. The horse would do as his heart told him, not what a man commanded. He stepped out from the firelight and moved toward the tree line, rifle in hand. The first torch came within 50 yards before a voice rang out, Whitman's, deep and steady. "Miles, you're a stubborn fool. I gave you a chance to walk away." Evan raised the rifle and shouted back, "And I told you he's not yours to take." The men spread out, forming a half circle. Whitman dismounted, snow crunching under his boots. His pale coat glowed faintly in the torchlight, like a specter. "You think this is about a horse? It's about what's owed. About respect." "You branded over your wife's mark," Evan said, his voice cutting through the still air. "You tried to erase her from Hittim, same way you erased her from yourself." Whitman froze. The torchlight painted sharp angles across his face, revealing the lines of years and guilt. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know she loved that animal," Evan said. "And I know the truth's burning you worse than any brand." Whitman's hand went to his revolver. "I should have finished this yesterday." The air cracked. His first shot fired wild, sparking off a rock near Evan's boots. Evan dropped behind a fallen log, returning fire. The echo tore through the trees, scattering a flock of crows into the sky. Shadowmane's head snapped up. The stallion gave a thunderous snort, pawing at the frozen ground. Evan shouted, "Stay back!" But it was too late. The stallion charged. He came out of the dark like a living storm, mane flying, hooves pounding the earth. Whitman's men turned their guns toward the sound, but the sight froze them. A massive shadow galloping straight through their torchlight, eyes blazing. One man's horse reared, throwing him into the snow. Another stumbled backward as Shadowmane barreled past, his flank brushing the fire, scattering sparks into the night. The stallion wheeled sharply, blocking the path to the foals. Whitman shouted, "Hold your fire!" But panic had already taken his men. Shots cracked in all directions. Evan fired twice, one bullet striking a rifle clean out of a man's hands, the other hitting the ground near Whitman's boots. "You're done here, Cole!" he yelled. But the chaos didn't stop. One stray round grazed Shadowmane's shoulder. The stallion reared, a sound ripping from his throat that shook the trees. The foals whinnied, bolting from their shelter. Evan ran toward them, heart hammering. "Easy, boy!" he shouted. "Hold on!" The wind whipped sparks into a frenzy. A torch hit the snow, then another. One rolled into the brush near the old sled, still piled with dry straw. It ignited instantly. Flames leapt high, painting the night in orange and gold. "Fire!" someone screamed. The blaze spread fast, the heat rising off the ground in waves. The foals stumbled toward the creek, Evan chasing after them through the smoke. He turned back just in time to see Whitman standing near the flames, revolver raised, aimed not at him, but at Shadowmane. "No!" Evan shouted, sprinting forward. The gun went off. The sound cracked through the storm like thunder. Shadowmane staggered, his hind leg folding under him. For a heartbeat, he looked straight at Evan. Wide eyes, dark and full of something that felt like forgiveness. Evan didn't think. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The bullet struck Whitman's revolver clean from his hand. It clattered into the snow, disappearing under the fire's glow. Whitman fell back, shock written across his face. Smoke thickened, curling through the air. The flames consumed what was left of the brush, roaring up into the treetops. Evan dropped to his knees beside Shadowmane. The stallion's breath came in ragged bursts, his coat slick with sweat and blood. "You're all right," Evan whispered, pressing a hand to the wound. You're all right, big fella. Whitman groaned, dragging himself upright a few yards away. You'll die for this, he spat. Evan looked up, eyes cold. Maybe, but not tonight. He grabbed a half-burned branch and swung it toward the dry hay near Whitman's boots. The flames caught instantly, forcing the man to retreat. His remaining riders, seeing the fire devour their path, pulled their horses back. Fall back, Whitman shouted, his voice breaking in the smoke. Get out! They fled, into the storm, leaving Whitman behind. The snow swallowed them one by one until only their hoofbeats remained. Evan turned back to Shadowmane, pressing his forehead against the stallion's neck. Hold on, he whispered again. You saved me once. Let me save you now. The stallion shuddered, eyes half closed, breath steaming in the cold air. But he was still alive, still fighting. Evan tore a strip from his coat, wrapping it tight around the wound. The bleeding slowed. That's it, he murmured. Stay with me. The fire hissed and began to die, the snow melting around it into black slush. Whitman stumbled backward through the haze, clutching his burned hand. He looked once at the man and the horse kneeling in the glow, and something broke in his face, rage giving way to something closer to sorrow. He turned and vanished into the dark. When the last torchlight disappeared, the world fell quiet again. Only the whisper of snow remained, soft and endless. Evan sat there beside the stallion, one hand on the great animal's neck, feeling the steady thrum of life beneath his palm. The foals had returned, nuzzling close to their mother's warmth. It's over, he said softly, though he wasn't sure he believed it. We're still here. Shadowmane's ear twitched. A faint sound escaped him, something between a sigh and a rumble. Evan smiled, weary but grateful. Yeah, he said. You're right. Not over yet. Above them, the last sparks of the fire drifted upward into the falling snow. Tiny stars swallowed by the night. Evan Miles stayed kneeling beside Shadowmane long after the flames died. The heat was gone, but the air still shimmered faintly from the memory of it. The snow around them steamed and hissed, and the smell of smoke clung to his clothes. Shadowmane's sides rose and fell with heavy effort, the cloth Evan had tied around his wound now dark and stiff with blood. Stay with me, Evan whispered. His voice cracked. You don't quit now. Not after everything. The stallion shifted slightly, a tremor running through his body. The foals pressed close, their small muzzles nudging at their mother's side, confused by the quiet. The fire's glow had faded to gray, leaving the world cold and colorless again. Evan forced himself to move. He tore more cloth from his coat, packed snow against the wound to slow the bleeding, and checked the stallion's breathing. He had worked cattle, broken horses, and even helped deliver colts before. But this was different. Every motion carried weight, a kind of reverence. When he was done, he sat back, his hands shaking from exhaustion. That's all I can do, he murmured. The rest is up to you. From the dark behind him came the crunch of boots on snow. Evan's body stiffened. He snatched up his rifle and turned, eyes narrowing against the wind. A figure emerged from the shadow of the trees, staggering, not steady. Cole Whitman. The once proud man looked half broken now, his fur coat scorched, his left hand wrapped in a strip of torn linen. His eyes were sunken, his expression hollow. He stopped a few paces away and stared at the scene before him. The wounded stallion, the foals, the man kneeling in the snow. Evan raised the rifle halfway, unsure whether to fire or simply warn him off. You've done enough, Whitman. Turn around. Whitman's voice came low, brittle as ice. He's still alive. Because of luck, Evan said, and because you didn't hit what you aimed for. Whitman shook his head slowly. I never meant to kill him. That's a lie. No. The older man took a step closer, unsteady. I meant to stop him. You don't understand what that horse has done. Evan's jaw tightened. I know what you did. To him and to her. I saw the mark. That stopped Whitman cold. For a long moment, only the wind moved between them. His shoulders sagged and his voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. You found the E? Evan nodded once. She branded him herself, didn't she? Whitman let out a sound that was half laugh, half groan. She said it made him part of the family. Said every creature on this ranch deserved a name and a home. I thought it was foolish. His eyes glistened with something sharp. Regret or anger, Evan couldn't tell. When she died in that cave, I couldn't stand to see him. Every time I looked at that horse, I saw her, so I burned it over. Thought if I erased her mark, I'd erase the memory too. Evan lowered the rifle, the tension easing in his shoulders, though not in his heart. You can't burn away guilt, Whitman. You just carry the scar where everyone can see it. Whitman looked past him at Shadowmane, who stirred faintly in the snow. He carried her, you know, that day. He ran from the mine with her on his back. She was already gone, but he brought her home. His voice broke. I couldn't see it then. Evan stared at the man, seeing not the ruthless land baron from before, but something smaller, a widower haunted by ghosts of his own making. You came here to finish it, Evan said quietly. So finish it. End it right. Whitman's gaze drifted to the pistol still holstered at his hip. For a moment, Evan thought he might draw it. But then, Whitman's hand dropped away. He turned instead toward the stallion, moving closer until he stood just beyond the reach of the foals. Shadowmane lifted his head weakly, one dark eye fixing on the man who had marked and hunted him. Whitman stopped short, trembling. I don't deserve forgiveness, he said. Evan said nothing. For a long time, the two figures, man and horse, simply looked at each other. Then Whitman bowed his head. I'll call off my men, he said, voice low. You have my word. I'll leave what's left of this land to you. Seems you're the better keeper of it. Evan's mouth tightened. You should tell that to her grave. Whitman nodded faintly, turning toward the ridge. Maybe I will. He walked away into the snow, his figure shrinking against the white until it disappeared completely. Evan stood in silence, the sound of wind filling the space where words had been. He didn't trust Whitman entirely, but he believed what he'd seen in his eyes. The hollow look of a man finally facing the truth. He turned back to Shadowmane, who lay still but breathing, steam curling from his nostrils. You heard him, Evan said softly. It's done. You can rest now. The stallion blinked slowly, then, with a trembling effort, shifted his weight and pushed himself upright. Evan's breath caught. The foals whickered, pressing against his legs as if lending their strength. Shadowmane stood, unsteady but proud, his head high against the wind. Evan grinned despite himself. That's it, big fella. Show the world you're still here. He reached out and laid his hand on the stallion's neck. The warmth there was strong, steady. He could feel the pulse, slow, sure, alive. The snow began again, soft flakes drifting down like forgiveness from the sky. Evan looked toward the distant valley where Whitman had gone. Sometimes, he murmured, it takes a man losing everything to see what he's already lost. He turned back to his small campfire, coaxing the embers back to life. The foals settled down again beside the warmth, their tiny forms glowing in the flickering light. Shadowmane stood just beyond them, his breath rolling slow and deep. Evan sat with his back against a tree, rifle resting across his knees. For the first time in years, he felt a strange calm, a sense that the land itself had finally stopped holding its breath. He whispered into the still air, "We'll make it through this winter." And though the night gave no reply, the soft rhythm of hooves shifting in the snow behind him was enough. The wind finally lost its voice. It drifted through the pines like a tired ghost and settled into quiet. By March, the valley no longer looked like a graveyard. Snow melted from the ridge in thin silver rivers that ran toward the creek. The burned cabin lay in ruins, black timbers half buried under new grass. But Evan Miles no longer saw it as an ending. It was the foundation of something waiting to be rebuilt. He worked through the thaw one day at a time, mending fences with scavenged posts, patching a roof over a lean-to where the fire had stopped. His hands bled, healed, then bled again. The ache in his shoulders became part of living, like breathing cold air. Shadowmane healed with him. The wound on his flank closed slow but clean under Dr. Nora Briggs's careful stitching. She came twice a week, bringing supplies and a quiet kind of encouragement that asked for nothing back. Each visit ended with her standing at the gate, watching the stallion limp through the pasture, shaking her head in wonder. "He shouldn't be alive," she said once. Evan smiled faintly. "Neither should I." The foals grew fast, their winter coats shedding into soft curls of gold and chestnut. They learned to run in the open again, chasing each other through puddles that reflected the sky. When they tired, they circled back to Shadowmane, pressing close against his legs. The big horse no longer carried the look of a fugitive. He had found something close to peace. Evan built a new shelter higher on the hill, a real barn this time, strong beams and wide stalls. He left the doors open day and night. "No walls for prisoners," he told them. "Only for rest." Sometimes, at dawn, he'd stand in the doorway with a cup of coffee, watching fog lift off the creek. The sound of hooves through wet earth, the snort of horses greeting the morning. Those noises had replaced the emptiness that once lived in him. One evening, near sunset, a rider came up the ridge. Evan reached for his rifle by habit, but let it fall when he saw who it was. Sheriff Alden Pike dismounted, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. "Got word from down south," the sheriff said. "Whitman signed over the deeds, your section of land included. He's leaving Montana for good. Says he's got no quarrel left here." Evan nodded slowly. "Guess even pride knows when to quit." Pike looked past him to the pasture where Shadowmane grazed. "Hell of an animal," he murmured. "Folks'll be talking about that storm for years." "Let 'em," Evan said. "Some stories are better told than forgotten." When the sheriff rode off, dusk folded around the ranch like a blanket. Evan walked to the fence line, resting his arms across the top rail. The stallion lifted his head, ears flicking, and came forward with that deliberate, powerful grace that no man could teach. They met in the half-light. Evan reached up and ran his hand down the horse's muzzle. The scar where the brand had been was fading now, hidden beneath new hair. "You've outlived him," Evan whispered. "Outlived the mark, too." Shadowmane blew a slow breath against his chest, warm and steady. Behind them, the foals played, their hooves splashing through the shallow pools left by melted snow. Evan looked across the valley where green was beginning to show through the thaw. For the first time since the blizzard, he felt the land breathe again, and with it, himself. He thought of that night months ago when he had opened a door he should have kept shut. If he'd chosen differently, there would be no fire, no scars, no redemption. The act that nearly killed him had also saved him. He smiled. Sometimes the fool's the only one who gets it right. The sun dipped low, turning the snow patches gold. Shadowmane stood beside him, calm and unmoving, the picture of strength at rest. Evan took a deep breath of the cold, clean air and said it again, firmer this time, as a promise to the land, to the animals, to himself. We'll live through this winter." The stallion answered with a deep rumble from his chest, half thunder, half sigh. The foals quieted, listening, and when the first stars blinked awake above the ridge, the ranch felt whole again. Man and horse, fire and snow, all of it stitched together by survival and simple, stubborn grace. Because kindness, he finally understood, doesn't end when the storm does. It's what teaches a soul how to begin again. The storm had come and gone, but its grace remained. If this story touched something quiet in you tonight, let me know down below. Even a simple 0 or 1 will do. It's your way of saying you felt it too. And if you want to ride with me through the next story, more dust, more heart, more wild grace, hit that subscribe button and stay close. Out here, every tale starts the same way, with a man, a horse, and a little bit of hope left standing after the storm.